strongly feels that one of the starting points are humans. It's how disasters affect humans, and of course how they affect ecosystems, but the starting point is really the human dimension, and we want to make sure that that's in the notes somewhere. Now, in terms of how to understand the social dimension, and we believe that, hello? Yeah. Part of that is looking at some of the tools already out there. There are already some very strong and well-used social tools like vulnerability and capacity analyses, but they don't always include an ecosystem component. The other tool that's often used, as was mentioned before, are maps, and they often have ecological resources, but not always a risk component. So there could be ways that looking at, I would say within a working group for bringing some of these tools forward, but also some of the new projects coming up, the EPIC project, and also the existing EBA project, to see whether some of these tools can be incorporated in EPIC as it starts. So testing some of these tools and maybe coming up with a model for how they can be used in other projects within IUCN. The second priority was promoting crosswork across commissions, and that included CEASP and the Red List of Ecosystems, to add maybe perhaps more of a social dimension to that. WCPA, there's a couple of the Asian World Parks Congress coming up, as well as the World Parks Congress, and it would be good to have a CEM presence there, whether that be both EBA or DRR to be seen. And I think a third point would be some specific, I would say, knowledge products. One being working with SEAL, and it comes also back towards a crosswork among commissions, which would be a more practical product on environmental law and standards for oil industries for spills. For EBA, we talked about the need for cross-cutting, and that can also be done through the EBA Mountain Project and through EPIC, but also possibly a knowledge product at some point with Angela and possibly Mike on resilience also, and others working on these issues. So I think that's basically the 3 points that we had. Did I miss anything? Group, help me out.
The only thing I would emphasize is, Karen mentioned it, but the starting point on the human dimension, we felt like that language needs to be integrated into the definition of what the Commission of Ecosystem Management is, and not have it focused only on environment. It has to include the human component in its, even in its red list of ecosystems.
Fair enough. Okay, moving quickly on. Are we ready now with EBA?
Yep.
Okay. We're within 6 minutes of the closure of the room. I think we can kind of eke out, but we'll probably lose our interpreters if we go much over.
Okay. So the first issue highlighted was the disjoint between in discussions between community-based adaptation and ecosystem-based adaptation, or social resilience and ecological resilience. And a concrete step that was suggested was if perhaps CEASP and CEM start talking a bit more to each other in the form of a joint task force or something like that. Also, species-based approaches and ecosystem-based approaches still seem to be quite separate from each other. The discussions and the activities have been in parallel to each other, and IUCN needs to bridge this as well. CEM does not appear to have community representation. There's a lot of ecosystem managers, but it doesn't have community representation. Again, this goes back to point number 1, perhaps look at how we work more closely with CEASP. Decision-making processes in IUCN, in the Union, does not adequately utilize community, what we're learning when we're implementing activities at a community level. Global decision-making doesn't appear to utilize the information we are we're gathering from our projects and interventions at community level to make sure we're making the right decisions in terms of adaptation. We also need to most strongly demonstrate the human dependency on ecosystems within the conservation community. Another issue that was raised was the nature of adaptation, since it's long-term. It's a long-term social, ecological change process. We tend not to capture the lessons learned from in the longer term of the interventions we're making now. And if there can be some kind of a process or a mechanism where this information is preserved, so we do have baselines to go back and compare and see if we're on the right track. For this, funding models make it challenging, so that's something we need to consider. How do we actually work with the funding models we have to still be able to measure our impacts in the longer term? What else was there? Island ecosystems offer an opportunity to demonstrate innovative approaches to disaster management strategies. That was a point that was raised. And also that we need to make a lot more effort in linking disaster risk reduction and ecosystem-based approaches. Thank you. Is there anything I've missed?
No time.
We discussed of course this was not published, so she didn't have time to, but we emerged the need for a decision-making process to use user-friendly tools for taking decisions, not based on common sense or experience, but on the existing data. So the dearth of tools to help decision maker using existing knowledge, existing data, because and in order to do this, you need the capacity to describe the ecosystem structure and functioning, and then integrate all the rest. So you need tools, informatic tools, to help decision maker describing ecosystem functioning and structure, and then you can approach all the other things, all the other steps, which is engaging communities, engaging stakeholders, and with the right terms of reference. So this, the dearth of tools and the need for tools for helping decision making to be quantitative, objectively monitorable. This is the message that came out from one of these presentation, and it was supported by the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Alfredo. Spot on. Who's reporting for the ecosystem red listing assessments? Ah, Jessica.
Thanks, Dave. Okay, so, sorry, it might be easier for me to sit down because it's hard to hold a laptop and a microphone. Okay, so the red listing points were that we need guidelines about how to classify ecosystems for terrestrial, freshwater and marine that aren't too rigid, and also use a multi-classification system. In doing this, we need to really focus on promoting a common interpretation of the criteria via the guidelines, and via having guidelines and a capacity building plan. And also there is need for data-related investments. So this is looking at the need to prioritize what data sets should be invested in, and who really needs to be investing in them. So it should have an approach which is devolving responsibility, but having a strong global voice around the demand for data, around what the global demand for data resources are. So in doing that, you need to look at both the global and continental, as well as what the institutional roles and mixing are around those, to make it strategically happen. It was also mentioned around standards for data sets and archiving, and that IUCN needs to have a coordinating role in this data set piece particularly. Coordinating? Yeah. So that was, did I miss anything from my group?
Just to clarify, that's on data standards. IUCN is going to be sort of a international standards bureau?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. It's my turn to report.
part of this concept is in order to implement the Red List at a global scale, the ambitious nature of what we're trying to do, the prototypes that have been done have highlighted certain key data sets that, for example, the role of space agencies, the European Space Agency, NASA, in organizing certain of those, Landsat-based or satellite-derived data sets to make this work is an example. Global digital elevation models. Okay, so there's an advocacy role for IUCN to encourage those kinds of investments by, let's say, government agencies, as well as sort of regional coordinating institutions, because we're learning through the process that's giving us the sense of priority. There are certain priority data sets that are clearly, there's an investment needed. That's part of what we're getting at. It's advocacy, perhaps, more so than the data standard.
Okay. Thank you. I think that I was elected to do the reporting on the Resilience and Ecosystem Services group. Much of our time was spent talking about the role of a working group or the possibility of a working group on resilience and what that group might actually do. What would it be its role? And much of the time we sort of went around the barn about how one divides the word resilience between social, economic, ecological, and other dimensions. And that led to a recognition that maybe that was, in fact, one of the more important roles of play is to provide a framework for interpreting and I think the term was disaggregating these different definitions and different impacts that we're dealing with on our ecosystems as it might be related to resilience. The role of looking, it was clear that there was an interest to see it go beyond the CEM, that there's relevance in other commissions, that there's the value not in reinventing the wheel here, but to reach out to established groups like the Resilience Alliance. I'll print my note here and say on the Resilience Institute in Stockholm or Center, but basically work with people that are involved in this movement rather than trying to start over. The idea of connecting the knowledge of the scholarship knowledge that is inherent in ecosystem management to practical information that's made available to others, both in informing policy and informing those working in managing ecosystems was discussed. The methodology for accomplishing that was not really sorted out. But I observed as we were concluding this discussion that really a lot of this has to do with how does the commission manage knowledge and communicate that knowledge to different audiences. And it's clearly something that I think that we need to be grappling with. We're great to talking to each other, but we need to also be aware that our value as an instrument of IUCN and ourselves, for that matter, is in our ability to communicate what we're doing. And so and from what I've heard from the other three presentations, what I've just said is congruent with the suggestions that came out of that. I am going to ask one question back to Karen. You talked about Pete mentioning a ready,
Right.
and you did not take that up, I take it, as a subject.
Well,
What I'll call, I won't go into acronym building here, but it's sort of an ecosystem.
roster.
Think of professional ecosystem managers being on a roster to be called on in a triage sense. And I'll say in my hemisphere, in my region, there have been 2 incidents in the last few years where that we would have had a need for such a device. One is the hurricane that hit Haiti, and we were incapable of responding, but we would have been an important factor in responding if we had that triage capacity. And the other, of course, is the oil spill that has been presented here. And Charlotte Moser here has been the lead in our North American group in responding to that. So, but we could have used a mechanism where we could have dialed an expert, if you will, and gotten some good input on how to even structure our response.
I don't know if Ed maybe know more about what he's trying to do. Do you want to respond to that?
No, I'm just asking.
Okay.
You did not.
Yeah, we didn't really have time to add that.
Huh?
We can't hear you down the back. Microphone.
Well, what she's saying is, no, they didn't discuss it. But then I'll ask the general group, is there a sense of resonance with this idea, or is this something we ought to just sort of say goodbye to? You and then Radhika.
Yeah, since there are...
I can't go any further than this.
But since there are very well established mechanisms for the early assessment, after disaster, I think it's a question of making sure that this mechanism becomes inserted and integrated in these existing mechanisms. That's how its findings would be very broadly disseminated within the existing systems, rather than creating something which is a standalone mechanism, I think.
Absolutely. Radhika, you're the last comment. We're being informed by the interpreters that they need a rest. And
I just want us to make sure that we are really clear on what our roster of experts will offer in addition to the joint unit that you and OCHA already have. One of our own very close colleagues, Murali, he's a key person who leads these kind of missions straight after disaster to do exactly this, the environmental assessments. And I know IUCN is quite welcome to join this environmental emergencies task force. So let's not create another standalone network, and make sure that it makes sense for us to have one if it's going to be a separate one.
okay, we're not talking about doing ecological response. I'll come back to that later. We need to bring this to a close. I want to first thank the interpreters for interpreting a very kind of program, and all of you for your contribution. This information, this input will be packaged for Pete and for Ed. This is a joint presentation, joint program commission effort, and based on this input and the steering committee's discussion of these issues, we'll be coming back with some kind of an idea of what the program will be. But I also want to point out that there are several working groups in the commission. What we've gone through here does not in any way have anything to do with questioning the future of these other groups. They will be assessed, and their value to the commission will be dealt with separately. So on that, I want to thank you.